I've had some problems with technical planning, so this might be a little bit ramshackle. I'll just do my best. I'll give a wave when to move the slides on, for example, now. Thank you. Okay, so Lord Woodbine, Harold Phillips, was born in Laventille, Trinidad in 1929. He was a Calypsonian, a Steelpanist, a very influential promoter of Caribbean music in the UK. And as Haru mentioned, there was a very important connection with the Beatles. 2 years ago, when I had the privilege and the pleasure of speaking at the last Biennial Steelpan conference, I spoke about how Lord Woodbine, I gave an outline of his role in the Beatles' work, and that talk is on YouTube. It is a travesty, really, that this gentleman, this musician, when he is mentioned in books about the Beatles, it's very, very briefly. Two, in some ways, very good books about the Beatles come out in the last 2 to 3 years by Mark Lewison and by Philip Norman. I do think it's very unfortunate, though, that Lord Woodbine is mentioned in just a paragraph or two. And most problematically, there is no significant mention of his musicianship. The very name, Lord Woodbine, he was Harold Phillips, but of course that name, Lord Woodbine, is a recognition of his status as a Calypsonian. So I'll just say a little bit about his background. So Harold Phillips was born in 1929, and his connections, so he was born in Trinidad, his connections with England began in 1943 when he joined the Royal Air Force and fought or served in World War II. Harold was actually underage when he joined the RAF, but there's a sign of his commitment there. He was 14 when he joined, and he did that by, according to stories I've heard, by taking his older brother's passport for enrolment, and that's how he was able to join at the age of 14. But I think there's something quite sort of obviously deeply honourable and moving about his contributions to British society, the world society in so many ways. He, after serving in the RAF, he returned to Trinidad, and there he began performing calypso on street corners. This is when he was in his mid to late teens. And he was an accomplished guitarist, but he was it seems to have been a very fast and confident learner, Lord Woodbine, a very talented individual who could work at all sorts of different things. Despite his youth when he joined the RAF, he became an air flight engineer. So, this was a really, really gifted individual, and musically he was deeply gifted too. A distinguished tenor panist who also made steel drums, steel pans, and a singer-songwriter, a Calypsonian. He was the first singer-songwriter that Lennon and McCartney would actually meet. This gentleman, Lord Woodbine, had previously toured in Jamaica in 1947 with Lord Kitchener. Returning to England in 1948 on Windrush, Woodbine was with Lord Beginner and Lord Kitchener. In Liverpool, where he went to live in 1949 and married and started a family, Woodbine formed a number of different steel bands and was one of the first steel panists to tour in the UK, as well as being one of the first Calypsonians. Winston Spree-Simon was a fellow member of the All-Caribbean Steel Band, initiated by Lord Woodbine. Just on that subject of his connections with Lord Kitchener, it's interesting to note that, and that this does come from Mark Lewison, One of the first, John Lennon had 2 LPs in the late 1950s. They were expensive then, and most people tended to buy singles. Lennon, as a late teenager, had 2 LPs. One of them was by Buddy Holly, the other was by Lord Kitchener. The first song that John Lennon ever wrote, it's not, to my knowledge, ever been recorded, but interviewed in 1971 about his songwriting, Lennon said that the first song he ever wrote was called Calypso Rock. Now, it's not entirely clear when the Beatles first came into contact with Lord Woodbine, but for some context, if you can just... So, I'm not able to actually show you the clip tonight, but I'll put this on my website, and I recommend that you look up this Calypso by Brother Valentino. It's a 7-minute history of Calypso. And on the next slide, this is the final verse of Brother Valentino's song. And then enter Harold Phillips, a man who would create history, a Calypsonian, a panist, plus a promoter from Laventille. In his colony club in England, where he promotes his Calypso show, these white boys would walk with their guitars, and together they'd jam the tempo. Then Woody told me a true story. Them white boys used to gig with he, about a historic concert they'd pull off in Hamburg, Germany. John, Paul, George and Ringo is Lord Woodbine made me to know. The famous Beatles in Liverpool pick up some vibes from wee Calypso. This is a very detailed, rich verse, and every phrase refers to something that I've had the pleasure of learning about from the kindness of people in Liverpool who allowed me to interview them about their memories of the early Beatles years, and in particular, the black music scenes of Liverpool in the 1950s and 60s. So he was a Calypsonian and a panist, but he was also a promoter. Throughout the 1950s, Lord Woodbine promoted various steel bands and organised tours through the UK, in particular in universities. But he also promoted the Beatles. He was so close to them from the years 1959 through to around 1961. He was so close to them that a lot of people still refer to him as their manager, as having been their manager. How strictly, formally true in a legal sense that might be, well, I'm not sure it matters so much, actually. What we know is that he promoted them by organising, offering bookings for them. It was Lord Woodbine who suggested that they actually get a permanent drummer, because it was just 3 of them at one point without a drummer. And of course, he was a percussionist himself. Hamburg. Actually, let's look at this other one. So these white boys would work with their guitars, and together they'd jam the tempo. So the Beatles, and if only we could have had a recording of this, but the Beatles, when Woodbine was performing Calypso and performing with the steel bands in the Colony Club in Liverpool, they apparently used to join in. He wasn't the only black musician in Liverpool that they followed. Jerry Gobin, a member of the steel band, was initially quite annoyed by the constant presence of these 2 white teenagers. Why did they keep following the steel band around? And there was a bit of sort of suspicion around that there might be something kind of exploitative going on. And that remains, and this was part of the subject of my PhD, that remains a difficult area. You know, the Beatles' debt to black musicians and black culture is absolutely massive, absolutely massive. And as part of Black History Month, I want to talk in a short while about some other influences that are not mentioned either. But yes, Hamburg, Germany. Lord Woodbine helped to literally drive them to Germany. The next slide. There he is, seated there. this was on the journey to Hamburg. So there's Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and the first Beatles drummer, Pete Best. Woodbine helped to set up those bookings for them. And on the Beatles' first night playing in Hamburg, which is a momentous occasion in the history of the Beatles, it was Woodbine who acted as support for them. He took to the stage first and performed some calypso. And that word support, I think, is really important. If we're talking about a line-up on an event, the support act might sometimes be regarded as more marginal, but without support, we can't build, can we? So, let's go on to the next slide. So this is Lord Woodbine in the 1960s, I think. Now, I'm not aware that any of his original lyrics have survived, but he may not have actually written them down. A musician in Liverpool named Steve Aldo, who kindly let me interview him, he actually sang me some extracts from calypsos that he recalled from his friend Lord Woodbine. Sometimes Woodbine would improvise, would take an existing calypso, such as Lord Beginner's Victory Calypso, and would improvise over it. Another one he used was Count Lasher's Talking Parrot. And what Woodbine would do, Steve Alders described to me, was he would just improvise new lyrics to transport them to a Liverpool setting. And I think this is a really important thing about what we know of Woodbine's work. So calypso as a way of commenting on topical events, on political events. In Laventille as a teenager, he would perform calypsos on street corners, accompanying himself on guitar. And what like many Calypsonians he did was he would specialise on the day's events. I said before, he was a very fast learner, a very quick-witted individual. And I find it interesting, this thing of calypso and what we know of Woodbine's calypso compositions and performances. This thing of addressing important topical events, calypso as a means of narrating news. Well, this was a big characteristic of the Beatles' later lyrics. I read the news today, oh boy, from A Day in the Life. She's Leaving Home was inspired by a newspaper article. Later on, as a solo artist, John Lennon would often write quite rapid lyrics. The album Sometime in New York City, he referred to it as being almost like journalism. Now, I'm aware that calypso is not the only, this thing of responding very swiftly to news is a characteristic of folk music in the broadest sense. But I just find it interesting that the very first singer-songwriter Lennon and McCartney would ever meet, he was 11 years older than them, but when they first met him, he was so far ahead of what the Beatles were doing at that point. They were still doing Love Me Do. In 1963, Woodbine performed in Hamburg. This was after the Beatles had stopped playing there. He performed a calypso in Hamburg with the title Hitler Rode into Berlin on the Back of a Donkey. With it being illegal in Germany at that time to mention Hitler in that kind of setting, he was deported. But the sheer audacity of that, again, says something very powerful about this man's originality. The next slide. So, the actual name Lord Woodbine, it comes from a calypso he composed about characters named after cigarette brands. Woodbine was the main one. So, yes, he was a smoker, but in a lot of the Beatles' books, you see, he was nicknamed Lord Woodbine because he smoked a lot of Woodbines, where it was actually to do with a composition of his. So again, in that name, there's a recognition of his gift as a songwriter. In 1980, Paul McCartney, talking back about the Beatles' earlier years, he said that in those early years, remember Lennon's first composition was Calypso Rock, He said that they were on the lookout for a new sound, and the UK music press, this was around 1960-61, was suggesting that Calypso was going to be the next big movement in British and American popular music. Now, people, for example, Harry Belafonte, his success can sort of explain that. But also in the UK, Woodbine was touring as a Calypsonian. So it's interesting that they found this individual so fascinating. And this pattern in the Beatles' work, they were always on the lookout for new sounds. And this continued throughout the career. You know, the sitar, electronic music from the avant-garde influences in Europe. But this openness to new sounds began in Liverpool, and it began in with the city's various black music scenes. That's an image from the Beatles' White Album. That's the nickname that it's been given because the front cover is just blank. But the album is formally titled simply The Beatles. And I tend to hear that album as a self-portrait. It's as if that album from 1968 lays bare their influences. So Chuck Berry, for instance, on Revolution back in the USSR, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were taught to play Chuck Berry riffs by a Liverpudlian Somali-Irish guitarist named Vinnie Ismail. I interviewed Vinnie Ismail's manager, George Roberts, a number of times. And now sometimes people have said to me, well, how can you believe all this stuff if you weren't there? And that, you know, that is a really important question. So something that I repeatedly come across is I would interview people in Liverpool who didn't actually know each other. So Lord Woodbine didn't actually know George Roberts. They didn't really know each other, but they described things in just the same way, that these two young white teenagers were absolutely fascinated by what was going on in the local black music scenes. And I'm not suggesting that it was a kind of callous exploitation. None of these people were rich or famous at the time. But what I do feel is that it's regrettable that historians haven't paid more attention to this whole dimension of the Beatles' history. I mean, another example is the song Obladi Obladar. As you may know, the title comes from Jimmy Scott, Nigerian conga player and singer-songwriter and friend of Paul McCartney. That song, Obladi Obladar, from 1968, McCartney later spoke about how it was partly in the context of Powellism and what Enoch Powell was saying with his vile rhetoric. So what McCartney did was to write a song about what he envisioned as a Caribbean family who are absolutely central to their community. Desmond has a barrow in the marketplace. Molly is a singer in the band. There's this, Paul McCartney's songs, there's a lot of loneliness there. The Fool on the Hill, Eleanor Rigby. Obladi Obladar is very much a song about belonging. And there is also a Liverpool connection there. In the third verse, if you listen to that song, in the third verse, you can hear John Lennon's piano imitating the sound of a steel pan. Okay. This wasn't just in the Beatles, within the Beatles' duration of the 1960s. There's Paul McCartney in 1975 in New Orleans with musician Ernie K. Doe. And when I put this on the website, if you follow that clip, it'll take you to a song, quite a famous song by Paul McCartney and Wings, called Listen to What the Man Said. Towards the end of that song, just listen to the chorus and you will hear steel pans. So this influence, this thing that started in Liverpool, persists a long way through their career. John Lennon with King Curtis, jazz saxophonist, in in 1971. Lennon collaborated with many black musicians as a post-Beatles artist. The Harlem Community Gospel Choir. When people, as they quite often are quite cynical towards my narrative of this, saying, well, how can you know? If this was such a big influence from black music scenes in Liverpool, then why doesn't the general public know more about it? And that is a huge problem. I've tried to actually ask Paul McCartney about this. As an academic, I don't really have access to celebrities. Celebrities speak to journalists, not academics. But what I would say is that he has actually mentioned Lord Woodbine quite often, actually, in interviews. He doesn't go into detail, and it's sad that he doesn't, say more about this man's musicianship. But I think this is a matter of historians overlooking things more than anything. So this is a controversial book. As a historian, I need to point out this is a very controversial book. It's a memoir by John Lennon and Yoko Ono's personal assistant from the last year of Lennon's life, Frederick Seaman. It's just a memoir of that year working in New York and in Bermuda with John Lennon and Yoko Ono. The problem with that book is that Yoko isn't presented very favourably at all in the book. I'm actually a huge admirer of Yoko Ono's work for all sorts of reasons. But the problem with this book is the author was charged with stealing from the Lennon's apartment after John Lennon's death. So that's a problem that needs to be acknowledged with this book. However, lots and lots of people around Lennon, including his son Julian and his first wife Cynthia, who died this year, have said that actually that's a really accurate portrayal of how John Lennon lived in the last year of his life. The reason why I'm mentioning it now is because what the book is, it's like a typescript of Frederick Seaman's diaries, and there's a lot of detail about Lennon's musical interests. So The Mighty Sparrow, there's this wonderful description in the book of how Frederick Seaman and John Lennon were driving through the countryside and the outskirts of New York, and The Mighty Sparrow came on the radio, and Lennon's ecstatic reaction to that. Lennon's interest in Calypso is mentioned numerous times in the book. And in the last summer of his life, 1980, John Lennon sailed to Bermuda. He was planning later that year to stage quite a major comeback as a recording artist, which he did, and as we know, he was tragically murdered. But the reason why this narrative of Frederick Seaman is important is because he describes in a lot of detail how when they got to Bermuda, with the purpose that Lennon would start writing songs again, he was scouring the record shops to find recordings by local bands. He was asking around, where can we go to hear the local black artists in Bermuda? He doesn't actually seem to have linked up with any local musicians in Bermuda. But 1980 seemed to mark a sort of revitalization. Well, it marked a revitalization in Lennon's recording career. He'd been away from the studio for 5 years. When it was revitalized, as was also the case in Liverpool, he drew very major inspiration from various black music scenes. Bob Marley and the Wailers' album Burning, which is actually from 1973, so quite old by then. If you follow that clip on YouTube, what you will hear is, if I'm asserting that the influence of Lord Woodbine needs to be recognised more, I suppose an important question is, well, what is influence? How do we detect it? How do we evidence it? The word influence comes from the same root, some told us, influenza. influence spreads in all sorts of unforeseen ways. But if you look at that clip, it's John Lennon in the studio recording a song called Borrowed Time, which was directly inspired by a Bob Marley lyric called Hallelujah Time. And what you can hear in that clip is he's telling the bass player how to get the sound of Get Up, Stand Up by the Wailers. I think that's a good example of how attentive Lennon was to musical detail. But there's another reason why I mentioned this. And in his last year, as I say, a kind of revitalisation of Lennon's passionate interest in black music scenes, the gospel choir on Double Fantasy. But what we also get are steel pans again, played by or led by Robert Greenridge. Two songs worth hearing by Lennon. Borrowed Time in particular. That is a song, the first line is "When I was younger." It's a bit like an echo of Help, but it's a sort of autobiographical song, and at the end he slips into this sort of semi-exaggerated Liverpudlian accent. He's singing about his early Liverpool years, and steel pans adorn that song. Another one, more well known, is the song Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy, which features Robert Greenidge more prominently on the steel pans. So I do feel that, just one more thing about that song, Borrowed Time. Electric guitar and steel pans, one of the very first people to use that combination was a group called the Rhythm Calypso Boys, around 1959 to 1960. They were led by Lord Woodbine. So while I feel a lot of frustrations about how this is sort of misnarrated or how it's ignored, how this whole narrative is ignored in sort of mainstream histories of the Beatles, things are changing, and that's so heartening to see. In the US, an academic, Mark Christian, is currently writing about this topic, as is an American author called Bob Seppican. Bob Seppican's book will be out in the next 2 years, and he interviewed Lord Woodbine in the 80s. Bob promises, is a friend of mine, promises that this book will be the most detailed account yet of Lord Woodbine's life and his relationship to the Beatles. The Power List, Mikey Massive, who I think is here, I hope so, wrote the entry for Lord Woodbine in the list of the 10 most powerful, most influential black musicians. Lord Woodbine was there. On Ajima Radio from Bristol, a programme about Calypso this last June, Woodbine was mentioned every bit as prominently as Lord Beginner and Lord Kitchener, with whom he travelled on, both of whom travelled on the Windrush. Radio 4, The Matter of the North, presented by Melvyn Bragg. We actually got to hear a recording of Lord Woodbine speaking in a programme that also featured David Hockney, Jimmy McGovern and Judi Dench. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography now has an entry on Lord Woodbine. A forthcoming film by David Bedford called Looking for Lennon is going to address this relationship in more depth. Next January, around the 15th of January, the Windrush Foundation will be holding an event to celebrate both, it's appropriate, both Martin Luther King and Lord Woodbine's birthday. Also, Arthur Dooley's statue in Liverpool in Toxteth, the Black Christ, was, I forget the technical term, but they took it down, cleaned it, restored it, put it back up again. Lord Woodbine was the model for that face of the Black Christ by the sculptor Arthur Dooley. Also, and again, that brought him into sort of media attention again this year, which was great. What seems to be happening is there's a lot of attention to Lord Woodbine as an individual. I think there still needs to be more about his relationship and importance in the Beatles' history. But also, to close, Andy Edwards, the Stoke-born artist and sculptor, created this statue of the Beatles in Liverpool. He is now working on a bronze bust of Lord Woodbine to go on public display. Okay, I'm going to finish there, but does anyone want to ask or say anything?
Just say thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm a huge Beatle fan. There's loads of stuff there I didn't know before. Thank you, James.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Are those, is it legal to publish that, or is that been published anywhere?
Are you referring to the 1990s play, Imagine, where the photo showed earlier on, where Lord Woodbine is with the Beatles on those steps? In 1992, there was a play in Liverpool called Imagine that was about the life of John Lennon. And I haven't seen this image myself, but Lord Woodbine saw it, and he'd been erased from it. Without having seen it myself, I can't really comment, but in some ways it's horribly symbolic of how things were then. As I say, I think things are changing. Slowly. Alex? These are clips that you'll find on my website.
Yeah, it's on your website.
Yeah, the way to find my website and the things about Lord Woodbine, just Google Lord Woodbine Academia.
Okay.
And so those clips, I particularly recommend the Lennon clips where he's using the steel pans. Yeah. Yeah.
When Calypsonians came up to England to record, 40s and 50s, BBC actually wrote on their records what they had in their archives, not to be played on the radio.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
And you can check BBC.
Right.
And I'm just asking, in this particular instance here, besides the issue of racism, which is obvious, but what is the conscious reason, especially for example, the labels, to whitewash the issue?
So what is the conscious reason?
No, I'm saying that is there a conscious strategy or something that is done deliberately by the publishers or the record producers or by the band members themselves? How does this come into play?
I don't sense that it is part of any strategy, but in 1998, when he was interviewed by Tony Henry for The Observer, Lord Woodbine was quoted as saying about the image where he was erased. He did say, maybe the great Beatles publicity machine didn't want some black man associated with them.
Yeah, but why? This is the question. Why? Well, that's the obvious thing. But I'm just saying that besides, is it that the publishers and the producers, the record owners are afraid that if we try to sell something that can be associated with black music, it won't sell? I'm trying to understand that.
Do you know what? I don't understand it myself, but I recognise it's a serious problem. I think...
I just think it may well have been the stringency of the programmers at radio. Well, I don't think publishers would want to hold something back that could earn them money for a hit.
That's true.
It wouldn't be publishers and record labels, it would have been whoever vets what goes out in broadcasting. In the days of Lord Reed, they were very, very stringent. I mean,
Yes.
I'm talking further back than the big time, but the pervading idea would be, I don't think this is safe for our teenagers to hear, so let's not play.
Yes.
Kind of thing. And that would have come more from the radio station than from the publishers and the record labels, because they wanted to sell music. So I can't see them trying to suppress it.
Yeah.
I feel my instinct.
I think one thing that I need to be blunt and frank about is, you know, I'm not black. I'm not from Liverpool and I wasn't born when these events took place. I have never had to experience or endure racism. It is problematic that it is a white person, a white male, as an academic, which is quite a sort of privileged position. It is problematic that I'm a person doing this. When I was doing my PhD, when I started my PhD, it was about Lennon and McCartney's songs, comparing how they approached themes of gender, class, and home. I didn't actually know about this side of the story until about 3/4 of the way through. And then, as soon as I knew that I should Google the name Lord Woodbine, I came across the 1998 Observer article. But what I'm saying is, there's a kind of blind spot, perhaps. Not just that people, that a lot of, I mean, most of the authors on the Beatles are white men. The way they dismiss Yoko Ono is also telling, and they often dismiss her with racism as well.
Post-World War II British attitude towards people from McGrath.
Yes.
It is. It's still amongst, especially the older generation, it's still that thing of, well, you know, River Choir, all that kind of attitude is still there.
Yeah.
Or was maybe in the 90s still there.
Yes. I feel that, and I have said this before, I said this last time I was talking here, with the racism, I think, you see, I nearly missed all this. I nearly just didn't find out about this. And that was accidental. But what a dreadful mistake to have made in a PhD if I was writing about the Beatles' history and I didn't turn this up. And I'm just frustrated that more authors don't, even if, like some people who are quite cynical towards me about this, even if they think that this is just a matter of urban myth or something, they still have a duty to acknowledge it, because there's too much evidence to dismiss this. And the evidence we have is too consistent. And there are lots of other things, like, the story of Paul McCartney and Fela Kuti in Lagos, 1973. McCartney goes to Lagos to record with Wings. Fela Kuti is very unhappy about that, accusing him of coming to Lagos to try and exploit the local music scenes and sell them as mass commercial products. New Orleans, McCartney went to record for his next album. It's a bit like Lennon and Bermuda. Also, I mentioned last time, Michael Abdul Malik, also known as Michael X. In 1969, he approached Lennon and he said to Lennon, you have stolen from the musical heritage of black musicians in Liverpool. You may have done it consciously or not, but you owe us. That's what Abdul Malik is quoted as saying in the biography, I forget the author's name, published in 1979. But Lennon responded. What he did was he began to associate himself with Abdul Malik and the Black House. Various publicity photos and things. I know Abdul Malik was a hugely problematic figure, but Lennon remained loyal to him to literally the last days of his life. Lennon even wrote to the Queen in 1974, having returned his MBE, asking the Queen to pardon Michael Abdul Malik, who was then hung in January 1975. What Lennon didn't do, though, was talk in any real depth about the Liverpool years and the role of black musicians there. It is also a problem, though, that people don't seem to ask the Beatles about this kind of thing. That's another side of it as well. Okay. All right, well, looks like that's come to a natural conclusion. Thanks for the help with the PowerPoints, and thanks for inviting me.